Professor Adam Tomkins is the Professor of Law at the University of Glasgow. He's got just as powerful a case to make to you on that front. Please welcome Adam Tomkins.
Good evening. In legal terms, what would happen in the event of a yes vote is that Scotland would become a new state in international law, and that the rest of the United Kingdom would continue as the continuator state. The United Kingdom would not be extinguished if Scotland voted to leave, just as the UK was not extinguished in 1922 when the Irish Free State came into being. Along with England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, Scotland is a member of the family of nations which we call the United Kingdom. And if Scotland walks out on that family, that is, if we vote yes to becoming a new independent state, the rest of the family will carry on without us. Now, the legal consequence of this is that the public institutions of the United Kingdom would automatically become the institutions of the rest of the United Kingdom. The UK Parliament would become the Parliament of the rest of the UK. The UK Supreme Court would become the Supreme Court of the rest of the UK. The same goes for the UK's defence and security and secret intelligence services. The Bank of England is a UK institution. So is the BBC. At the moment, these institutions exist to serve the public in all four of the UK's home nations. But if we vote to become independent, we vote to leave the UK. And if we leave the UK, we leave the protection, the advantages, and the benefits of the UK's public institutions, including the Bank of England and the BBC. Scotland would be entitled to no share in these institutions. What an independent Scotland would be entitled to is a fair share of the UK's assets, and indeed, of the UK's liabilities. When states break up, or when a territory within a state secedes to become a new state, the assets and liabilities of the state fall to be apportioned equitably, shared fairly even, between, in this instance, Scotland and the rest of the UK. Now, the apportionment of the UK's assets and liabilities would constitute a large part of the separation negotiations that would have to follow any yes vote in Thursday's referendum. And whilst the details would be a matter for politics, the law does provide a number of principles that would shape the negotiations. Among these legal principles are the following. First, the UK's fixed property in Scotland, government buildings, NHS hospitals and the like, would become the property of the new Scottish state. Conversely, that Scotland would have no claim on the UK's fixed property in the rest of the UK or overseas. Second, the UK's movable property in Scotland would become the property of the new Scottish state where it is specifically for local use. So an ambulance that is associated with, for example, the Southern General Hospital here in Glasgow would become the property of the new Scottish state because it could be shown to be specifically for local use here in Scotland. Thirdly, historical contribution is of no relevance to any of this. UK fixed property in Scotland would become the property of the new Scottish state, even if its construction had been paid for by UK taxpayers as a whole, with no compensation being due to the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, that's the end of the law. Why does any of this matter? Well, clearly, it won't matter at all if, as I hope, we reject the nationalists' offer this week and vote no. But, as I'm sure you've noticed, the polls have narrowed. Every vote counts. And if this goes wrong, if Scots do vote to quit the UK and to start afresh as a new state, these legal details will matter very much indeed. Your future prosperity, your future security will depend upon them. Which is why, as a lawyer, I am appalled that the nationalists have been so reckless, so cavalier, and so downright dishonest about these issues. And to start with the pound, the Scottish Government's famous Independence White Paper states that the pound is Scotland's currency just as much as it is the rest of the UK's. Wholly wrong in law. The pound is Scotland's currency now precisely because Scotland is part of the UK now. And if we vote to leave the UK, we will be voting to leave the UK's institutions, including the UK pound. Scotland could then seek to negotiate its way back into these institutions, but the rest of the UK would agree to this only if it was in their interests to do so. And we've seen that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, the Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, who we shall hear from in a moment, have each ruled this out as being contrary, not only to the economic interests of the rest of the UK, but also to their political interests. Now, this does not mean that Scotland would be unable to use the pound. Any state may use the currency of another state, as Panama uses the US dollar, for example. But for a state to make this choice means that that state has no control over its monetary policy or its interest rates, as we've just heard. Rather, these matters are effectively surrendered to what would be a foreign power. And my colleague, Ronnie MacDonald, has explained to you already this evening why this would be economic catastrophe for Scotland. What I have to say to you is that the SNP's position on the currency is also legal nonsense. The SNP say that if they cannot have a currency union, they will refuse their share of the UK's national debt. But this is both economic madness and legal illiteracy. If an independent Scotland, that's the nicest thing I could think of to describe. If I was being really honest, I wouldn't have used that language. Let me explain to you why it's legally illiterate. If an independent Scotland were to refuse its share of the UK's debts, the rest of the UK would be perfectly within its rights to withhold from Scotland her share of the UK's assets. That's how it works. Liabilities run with assets. And the Bank of England is not an asset. It's a public institution. The currency reserves buried deep in the Bank of England's vaults, if there are any left, Danny, they are assets. They are assets, but the First Minister's demands are not merely to his fair share of those, but to joint control of the bank itself. And as others have said, this is a plan which is devoid of precedent and entirely fanciful. Neither is the pound an asset. It's a means of exchange. It isn't Scotland's pound. It isn't England's either. When the First Minister declaims from his perch in the Scottish Parliament that it's our pound and we're keeping it, he's talking legal nonsense. It's not Scotland's pound, and it's not England's either. It's the UK pound. And if you vote to leave the UK, you vote to leave the UK's public institutions, including the UK pound. But it's not just in relation to the pound where the UK have failed to understand even the basics of the law governing state separation. Let me give you one other example. On the UK's embassies, the White Paper states that Scotland would be entitled to a fair share of the UK's extensive overseas properties, allowing us to use existing premises for some overseas posts, unquote. Again, wholly mistaken in law. International law provides that state property would remain the property of the continuator state, the rest of the UK, unless it was located in the territory of the new state, Scotland. And I checked. None of the UK's embassies are located in Scotland. Now, the UK government understand this correctly. Do you know why? Because they took legal advice. And you know what? They even listened to it. They have pointed out that an independent Scottish state would not be entitled by right to any UK diplomatic premises, equipment, or staff. And the legal position is clear. The bodies that support the UK now would operate on behalf of the remainder of the UK if Scotland votes to leave the UK. The UK has a vast diplomatic network to keep us safe when we travel abroad. 14,000 staff in 267 embassies and consulates located in 154 territories and countries right around the world. The SNP are wholly wrong to imagine that an independent Scotland would have any claim on this at all. An independent Scotland would have to start from scratch to build its own diplomatic network, with what resources they've never made clear. Ladies and gentlemen, the SNP would have you believe that voting yes is a risk-free option. Overnight, you could lose all the things you don't like about the British state without losing any of the things that you do like. But it's a fundamentally dishonest position. A yes vote is not remotely risk-free. A yes vote would cost Scottish jobs. Just look at what the banks and the financial services have been saying to us in the last week or two. A yes vote would cost Scottish trade. Scotland trades more than twice as much with the rest of the UK as it does with the rest of the world put together, and creating a new international frontier between us and our nearest neighbour would inhibit and diminish Scottish trade considerably. A yes vote would cost Scottish households. Supermarket goods would be more expensive, family budgets even more squeezed than they are already. And a yes vote would cost the Scottish taxpayer dear. Walk away from the Bank of England, we'd need a new central bank of our own. Walk away from the UK, we'd need new defence and security services of our own. Leave Britain, and we'd need a new diplomatic corps of our own. We'd have to find the people, we'd have to train them, we'd have to pay them, and we'd have to buy the buildings to put them in. Only 3 days away from the referendum, and the SNP have still not explained to us, the people of Scotland, how much this would cost or where the money is coming from. We are being sold a false prospectus, ladies and gentlemen. The SNP's plans for Scotland are economically ruinous, but they are also based on a fundamental misconception of what independence would mean as a matter of law. Don't let them pull the wool over your eyes. Send them away to think again and vote no.